workshop. We'll get started tonight. I just want to start out this evening by acknowledging that we are, talking about lands that are the traditional territorial lands of the coastal Miwok people. And for thousands of years, Mount Tamalpais watershed and surrounding lands were occupied and stewarded by the villages of the coastal Miwok tribe, and as well as the Federated Indians of Creighton Rancheria. We want to acknowledge the stewardship and longstanding connection that these communities have and continue to foster with Mount Tamalpais. Now, since 1921, Marin Water has been stewarding these Mount Tamalpais watershed lands for the primary purpose of providing clean, safe drinking water to communities in central and southern Marin. The district has embarked on a series of community workshops and site visits to inform the development of the Watershed Recreation Management Plan. We're here tonight at workshop number 4. We'll be continuing our discussions around how to best steward these public lands while considering opportunities for advancing multi-benefit solutions that address various watershed visitor and land management issues. So tonight we put together a presentation for you that we're going to kind of go into our recreation and visitor facilities that we have, just to kind of ground our discussion around Mount Tam and the features that have been developed over the years that we all utilize to recreate and connect with the mountain. Then we've brought together a panel discussion of technical experts from organizations around the Bay Area to have a discussion about multi-benefit solutions and how they're grappling with various issues in regards to visitor management and stewardship. And then we're going to take some time to go through breakout groups. We're going to workshop a number of recreation facility concepts and look for multi-benefit solutions with all the stakeholders through kind of collaborative discussions. And then we'll have some closing thoughts. So I'm going to take the first 10 minutes or so to walk you through kind of some of our visitor management. But before we get started, I just want to kind of put some ground rules out there for the night and just remind all of us to respect competing views, make space for alternative perspectives, recognize differences, and just kind of reflect on the last meeting that we had that was around stewardship, and the conversations were really good and helpful. I think that we can all say that we made space for folks, but we could probably do a better job of listening to other folks' perspectives, making sure that we don't dominate the conversation with kind of interest-based perspectives, and really allow for this to be kind of a multi-benefit solution-based planning process. So we just want to remind folks tonight that that's really the intention and goal behind having these kind of community workshops and ongoing discussions. So acknowledge that at the end of this all, we'll be compromising to kind of come up with some of those solutions. So this is the infographic that we put together to kind of help people understand where we are and where we're going through this process. We've worked through our introduction and project overview in our first meeting back in June. In July, we started working on our overarching goals and objectives for this planning process. The last meeting, we workshopped stewardship and had discussion broadly with the community about programs we might want to develop and focus on. And now tonight, we're starting our discussion around recreational facilities. And we appreciate and understand that folks have been waiting patiently to kind of have this conversation and start grappling with these topics. So I do just want to kind of start with this, discussion will happen over 3 meetings. We'll have the beginning tonight, and then we'll have a site visit on November 9th, where we'll go and take a walk and look at the Azalea Hill project that's been developed and the planning process that guided that effort. And then we'll come back here in a virtual format, likely in February, and start talking about various visitor management strategies that we might want to push forward through this process. Oops, sorry about that. So you've seen this slide before. This is kind of just our overarching kind of what is on the watershed, how do people utilize it, and we're going to dive kind of into each one of these bullet points just to kind of remind us what we're talking about here tonight. And as we focus on the watershed, we have to remind you all and ourselves that when we're doing this planning process, we're really grounding ourselves in what the district's primary mission is, and that is to provide drinking water to the communities and steward Mount Tamalpais. So we do have overarching missions as an organization that kind of identify how we manage the watershed. We have guiding policies from our board that outline kind of the priorities that we should take. And then we also have these federal and state regulations that we operate under. So we are a state drinking water, we're regulated by the state drinking water regulations. We also have to comply with state and federal Endangered Species Act and California Environmental Quality Act. So we understand and appreciate that kind of long-term planning processes can be frustrating, but as a water district, we have to acknowledge and recognize that this is the structure in which we're working under. So just a reminder to all of us as we think through the different types of outcomes that we want to see in this planning process, we have to make sure that they align with these kind of overarching guiding documents. So the district, as a water district, we have 7 reservoirs. We provide water to 190 community members throughout the service area, and this is our primary mission, and all of our activities have to kind of link up and support this primary mission. We also manage 22,000 acres of watershed land. These lands are home to a host of biological species that we need to protect and steward and support. We have over 1,000 plant species on the mountain, 44 rare plant species. We have over 400 wildlife species that we know of. And we also have management issues associated with this landscape. We have invasive species that we manage on an annual basis, and we have to think about how our recreational activities might impact these sensitive resources. That's going to be a lot of our focus, and that's part of our mandate as a water district, to steward these lands. So now visitors, we know that we have over 1.8 million visitors that come to the watershed every year. We have a number of facilities that support their access to the watershed. Those visitor facilities range from picnic areas, some of those in kind of front country locations, some of them in remote locations. We have unique partnerships with nonprofits that lease property from the district, such as Marin Stables, West Point Inn. We have 34 restrooms, 32 trash receptacles. We have water fountains and horse troughs that kind of support all of our collective activities on the watershed. And these facilities are really critical to reducing our collective impact on the watershed as well. Now, one of the major ways that we communicate with visitors when they're on the watershed is our watershed signs. We have signs that outline our regulations, what's allowed. We have interpretive signs that try to educate folks about the resources and the way we manage the watershed. We have location signs letting you know where you are, directional signs on trails, areas that delineate sensitive areas that we're trying to avoid or restore, and then kind of guidelines around how you recreate, slow zones, trying to kind of help people recreate responsibly. So all of this is one way that we communicate with people, and it's likely something that we reflect on and look at as we go through this recreation planning process. Now we have 92 miles of fire roads that visitors can utilize to access the watershed. That's for hiking, biking, equestrian, and others. This also supports our emergency response activities, as well as allows us to operate the watershed for the water services that we provide. And that's a critical component of it. So I think one key piece of this all is to recognize that all modes of recreation have access to the watershed in terms of passive recreation. 92 miles is a significant trail network. We also appreciate and recognize that in previous meetings, we're hearing that some folks want to have different opportunities on the watershed. We do have hiking trails and equestrian trails that are available. We have about 59 miles of these trails that have been developed. They do separate hikers from bikers, so that separation is part of our management strategy and approach. We have a largely legacy network of trails. So many of the trails were adopted from previous uses of the landscape. And so sometimes that does cause issues in terms of managing how people move across the landscape. We also have about 70 miles of social trails that have been established from people exploring the watershed. These social trails can have an impact on the landscape, and these are unmaintained trails that people utilize. So we do have a Project Restore component of our roads and trails plan that helps us close some of these social trails down. We really focus on new social trails that are being established, but what we've learned over the years is that when you close a trail down, you're just moving that impact or that use somewhere else. And so often you have to pair these trail closure projects with other opportunities. And I think our Azalea Hill project that we're going to be seeing on at our next meeting really reflects kind of that balanced approach of closing trails while you're also providing multi-use access in a different way. So visitor management issues, we do see a lot of visitors on the watershed. They do have an impact, and that's all of our activities collectively. We see non-system trails that may cross sensitive resources. We see illegal bike use on trails that may just be for hiking that we have to manage. We have parking congestion in some of our more crowded trailheads. We have trails that maybe weren't designed for the level of use that they're receiving. So all of this is kind of elements that we're trying to think through when we think of a holistic watershed recreation management plan. We have trash receptacles. We try not to put too many out because we can have wildlife issues with those receptacles. We've been seeing bears on the watershed recently, and that's great, but also a new management component for us to consider. We do have some trails that are part of those legacy trails that maybe were poorly located, and there's a large significant effort to kind of relocate those to support access. So now through these planning meetings, we really appreciate, we've been getting good comments from the public, and we've kind of started to see these comments drop into themes around watershed health, safety, stewardship. kind of interest-based outcomes that folks want to see us focus on, and some of the recreation facilities that we might need to improve or focus some attention on. And that's really great, but I think what we're trying to hope and hopefully getting at tonight as we start and continue these discussions is starting to find the overlap between some of these components. So moving beyond kind of an interest-based outcome from this planning process and thinking about how our outcomes can support solving some of the recreation-related issues that folks have brought forward during this discussion, and how we can make these kind of multi-benefit solutions. So I think what we're hoping as we move into our breakouts tonight, that folks really try to bring their ideas forward in terms of ways that they can solve other visitors' issues while also achieving their own desired outcomes. So with that, I'm going to move us into our panel discussion shortly, but I really just wanted to reflect and remind folks tonight we are focused on kind of those multi-benefit outcomes that we might be able to develop as part of this process. So we really want to move away from those interest-based outcomes, try to think about how our multi-benefit solutions can really address not only your own interests or perceived issues, but those of other visitors on the mountain. We really would like everyone to bring kind of empathy to their thinking in regards to how they're hearing people, and take time to listen to try to kind of find common ground as we go through this. And so as part of that listening, we wanted to bring a panel together to really think about different solutions that are being brought forward in other areas, and what other organizations are doing to help address some of these similar recreational issues. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and introduce you to our panel, or have our panel introduce themselves. We're going to start with Aurora Perez from Latino Outdoors. And I'm going to have each of the panelists, if you will, just tell us your name, your organization that you come from, and something that you love about the outdoors and want to share with others. So Aurora, do you want to go first?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Sean. Hi, everyone. My name is Aurora Perez. I'm the San Francisco Bay Area Regional Coordinator, working with Latino Outdoors. And oh gosh, I have so many favorite things about the outdoors. I think that some of my favorite hobby is climbing. So climbing outdoors is definitely one of my favorite things.
Great, thanks, Aurora. Next, I'm going to ask Brian. Do you want to introduce yourself, Brian?
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Brian Largay. I'm Conservation Director at the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County, and it's a pleasure to be with you all tonight. I think my favorite thing outdoors is taking a night hike after a rain with little kids to look for salamanders. That's one of my favorite things to do outside.
Awesome, thanks, Brian. And how about you, Matt?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me tonight. I'm Matt DeYoung. I'm Executive Director at the Santa Cruz Mountains Trail Stewardship, formerly Mountain Bikers of Santa Cruz. My favorite thing about the outdoors is just that sense of wonder that the outdoors imparts like nothing else.
Great, appreciate that. So what we're hoping to do with the panel tonight, we're going to have a moderated discussion. We've developed a few questions for each of our panelists, and then we've got a couple questions at the end to bring the discussion together. We're going to give them time to kind of help us understand what they're working on and what solutions they might have found around some of their planning efforts in regards to recreation. So we're going to start with you, Aurora. And kind of to kick it off, we just want to know, how is Latino Outdoors working with land managers and the community at large to support diversity, equity, and inclusion from a recreational standpoint?
Yeah, of course. So just to share a little bit about Latino Outdoors, a lot of the work that we do is centered around justice, equity, inclusion, accessibility. So Latino Outdoors is really a national community of people that organize all sorts of outdoor recreational activities. So here in the Bay Area, we have a team of volunteers mostly, and who organize all sorts of fun activities for people to explore out in the outdoors. So we host events all across the North Bay, the South Bay, the East Bay. And we've done a couple of things out at Marin Water, actually. And so to really promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, our primary focus is reaching out to communities that maybe have not experienced that sort of outdoor recreational activity. For example, we've done things like beginning backpacking events. We've done intro to fishing, introduction to hiking. And so it's really just, again, introducing people to these activities and providing a safe and welcoming space for them to feel empowered to go explore on their own. So in Marin Water, or more specifically in the North Bay, we outreach to organizations that are located in low resource communities. We go out to schools, middle schools, elementary schools, Title I schools that don't necessarily have a lot of resources. And we try to provide as much as we can to help break down some of the barriers that they might have when trying to go and explore a park in their area. You know, a lot of the things that we do is partner with land managers or land management agencies so that we can bring these community groups out to these parks and really provide an experience where these community members feel like they belong in these parks. And then by doing that, they have this sense of stewardship. They have a sense of wanting to protect and care for the land. So it's a multi-step process of creating a space where people feel comfortable and then fall in love with these spaces. It's super easy to fall in love with spaces like in Marin Water, where you have all these beautiful views, these redwood tree groves, and just getting people to fall in love with these spaces then promotes more of a sense of wanting to protect these spaces. So really what we're doing is, breaking down some of the barriers that exist to get to these parks so that we can create a safe and welcoming space for folks.
That's fantastic, Aurora. Thanks for all that work. Now, folks might not know that you actually worked with Marin Water, leading some of our outreach programs. So maybe tell us a little bit, what did you do when you brought your groups out to the Water District? What was the experience like? What did you see? You know, where'd you go?
Yeah, so I did do a season over at Marin Water, and I was doing a lot of habitat restoration and volunteer management, and I loved it. I think that those two are my favorite things to do, is some sort of stewardship, habitat restoration, and then connecting communities to the outdoors. And so the couple times that we've done Latino outdoors events at Marin Water, we've done things like litter cleanups, and it was so fun. We had like a group of about 20 folks out there, kids and moms and parents, and we made a little game out of it, and people will get really competitive when you turn it into a game. And we picked up like 7 bags of litter, and at first we're like, oh, this place is so clean, like there's nothing here. But then when you really start looking and taking the time to take it slow, you can collect quite a few bags of litter and trash. So we've done a couple litter cleanups when we've been out on the watershed, and even that activity, not a lot of people have intentionally gone out to a park to do litter cleanups. So again, just introducing people to the idea of like, hey, you might have not thought about coming out to clean the park, but doing your part to make it better than it was really goes a long way. And so just introducing that activity, I think, really did change the perspective of a lot of people. Just again, even leaving it better than you found it. And then we've also just done nature hikes around. We've gone to Bon Tempe and Lake Lagunitas and just talked about newts and redwood trees and water conservation and what we can all do in our own communities to really conserve water and protect the planet. So again, just these ideas that people hadn't really put too much thought into or didn't know that their single actions can still help. And, you know, every little bit helps. And so we've done some of those things out at Marin Water, and it's just been really fun and awesome to see the community members that live not too far away, that are living in San Rafael neighborhoods, visiting this park for the very first time. So I think that has also been my favorite part, is just connecting people to these parks that are not too far away from home, but they just hadn't had the opportunity to go explore yet.
That's great. I think we all appreciate like how amazing it is to be on Mount Tam, but to have people seeing it and visiting it for the first time is a special thing. And I think, the benefit of public lands for sure, and the health and the well-being of things to the community in that way. So maybe you have a really interesting perspective, Aurora, right? You've worked on the side of the land management, and now you're working with a nonprofit that's connecting to the community. Kind of, can you kind of help us understand or educate us on like what barriers can we really try to address through a recreation management plan? And do you have any thoughts in terms of those barriers and how we can help remove them?
Yeah, when thinking about, when I'm thinking about a space or park to visit in terms of bringing out a community group, I always think about all of the, recreational facilities that exist in the park already. So I want to find a location that might have some amenities that are a little bit more friendly for beginners to a space. And so oftentimes some of the barriers that exist just for the community members to get to a park is transportation. That's always kind of a big one for folks. And I think that whenever we host events, we definitely try to provide transportation if we can. We encourage carpooling, caravanning, meeting in one space, and then filling up the cars to go to our destination. And that's just kind of one way to encourage folks to not let transportation hold them back from visiting a space. And then we've also have found that just the knowledge that is required for folks the knowledge, like these spaces exist, but people don't know how to get there, don't know where to park, don't know if there's any like park rules or regulations. So just providing that information for folks, letting people know like, this is what the trail conditions look like. This is the distance. There are no pets allowed. There are pets allowed, but must be on leash. So those little details I think are really important, because oftentimes I've noticed that a lot of our participants aren't super internet savvy. And so just like getting to that information can be a little more difficult than people might think. So just being able to share some of that knowledge with folks for our outings is really important. And then other things in terms of organizing community outings and hikes as an organizer, I think that sometimes just, depending, again, in the Bay Area, there's so many parks, so many land managing agencies, and every agency has their own sort of process or permit process. Right. And so sometimes I've noticed it's a little bit difficult to get through that permit process, whether there's a fee to just apply to have a group out there, or the time needed. Like some places require like months in advance just to have a permit to be able to take a group out there, which I totally understand for maybe like bigger events that might require more equipment. But really when you just want to experience the outdoors with a group of people, I think that having that bigger permit process creates a barrier for people that are wanting to just gather and be in community in the outdoors. So
yeah, absolutely. And that's a good two things that you said there, Aurora, that really kind of resonated were, one, right, not everyone has access. The park isn't in everyone's backyard, and that's a really important thing to think about from a community perspective. And then also, right, the barrier in terms of permits for allowing for events to happen. And I think one thing that you've worked with us on is, right, we have volunteer events, and that's one way that we kind of navigate that. And then the permit is not required because, right, we're co-hosting a volunteer activity. So those are kind of critical components. So I want to take a minute and bring Brian into the conversation from the Santa Cruz Land Trust, and pose a question to him and just kind of open it up. Like, Brian, tell us about how Santa Cruz Land Trust balances the protection of cultural, natural, and biological resources while facilitating public visitor access to some of your lands.
Sure. Thanks very much for inviting me to the conversation. And it's nice to be a part of this, in part because Marin Water is reaching out to the community. It's interesting to have an organization with a primary mission of providing water being so willing to work with its community to host almost 2 million people a year on your lands and have such an extensive trail network. That's really, really impressive. Land Trust of Santa Cruz County manages about 16,000 acres of property that we've protected, mostly in Santa Cruz County. And we have 4 mission directives: preservation of biodiversity, protection of water resources, support for working lands like farming, grazing, timber production, and also healthy communities, which is largely expressed through promoting access in a sustainable way. And as you can imagine, all four of those things have a little bit of tension between them. Biodiversity and working lands can be in conflict. Recreation and working lands, recreation and biodiversity can be in conflict. Water resources are vulnerable in a variety of ways. And so a lot of the work that I do is involved in determining how those impacts can happen and what strategies can we employ to avoid those impacts and minimize them. We take a variety of approaches. There are three tenets. One is design, carefully designing access, carefully designing working lands operations so that impacts to biodiversity are avoided. And that can have to do with the macro scale of where you put trails, for example, so that you steer visitors away from sensitive resources, to how you do the layout of a particular trail so that it sheds water in a way that's not going to cause erosion and is going to be low maintenance and sustainable. We also think in terms of management practices. What are we going to do on a day-to-day basis to make sure that impacts are addressed and don't get out of hand? And maybe that's as simple as making sure that the rolling dips or grade reversals in the trails are shoveled out before the winter so that the drainage is sustained. Maybe it has to do with making sure people know that there's people out on the land, and if you go and you create a volunteer trail and damage a certain area, that's going to be someone's job for the next 3 weeks is going to be packing brush on that and fixing the mess, and that you're making work for somebody. It's not like you can just do that stuff and have it sit there damaging the landscape and not affect other people. Or maybe it's picking up the trash or maintaining the restrooms in a way that create decent conditions for everybody. And then the third kind of prong to our strategy is adaptive management, where we engage in monitoring outcomes, making sure that the management strategies we've deployed are working. And if they're not, changing our strategy so that they do. And I can go into more detail on all of that as you like.
Yeah, no, that's great, Brian. Maybe just kind of help us think about, or just share with us maybe some of the multi-benefit visitor management solutions that you guys have developed in Santa Cruz to help mitigate kind of those recreational issues that might arise when you're allowing folks onto the lands that you manage.
Sure. I think that so one of the base perspectives that we take, and I think having the right framing is really important, is to look closely at the individual recreational activities that someone might engage in and asking the questions, what and how might this activity impact the resource? And then how can we manage the activity with design, management, and adaptive management to address those impacts? So, one example that we got is one of the properties that we manage has a lot of very sensitive wildflower stands, and running trails through those areas can impact those resources. It so happens that there's some oak woodland and redwood forest nearby, and actually running trails through the woodlands under the canopy of the trees makes those trails a lot less prone to erosion and has other benefits. So in general, we will route our trails under the canopy rather than through the middle of the meadow, where the soils might be more fragile and the wildflowers might be more impacted. Another example is mountain lion denning. Some of the properties that we manage are core mountain lion habitat, and we ended up giving very substantial buffers, about half-mile buffers around known mountain lion denning areas. And at the same time, we wanted to make sure that the recreational experience was fantastic. And one of the elements to create a great experience was having a lot of trail miles and a lot of loops. And so what we ended up doing was kind of packing the trail miles into certain parts of the property where we could have dense trail networks through forests, and people could get their 10,000 steps or their 8-mile ride in without even actually realizing that they're kind of wiggling around a lot in a relatively small part of the property. And so people achieve their recreational objectives while at the same time giving big buffers from those sensitive habitat areas.
Yeah, that's great, Brent.
Yeah.
When you're kind of talking about that, I was just thinking, right, Marin Water has a lot of legacy trails, right? And we often make an assumption that keeping things as they are is the best route to reduce our impact. But in reality, kind of what you're helping us understand is like proactive management can really help kind of reduce the impact that these trails might have on sensitive natural resources by kind of proactive planning and thoughtful design around where they're being located.
Yes, on many of the properties that we've gotten involved in have legacy road networks from timber harvest or grazing management or recreational grading. It's not entirely clear why all of these roads exist, but roads are a nightmare. They're challenging for drainage. They're challenging to maintain. Some of them are really unsuitable for recreational use because they can be very steep and a misery to hike on. Some of them have loose surfaces, and so if you're riding a bike on them, it's really easy to crash. And what we found is that there's a perception that a fire road makes a perfectly nice trail. In our experience, it makes a pretty lousy trail. There's also a perception that a trail has the same environmental impact as a road. And so adding new trails is like adding new roads. And I would dispute that thoroughly. The impacts from roads on habitat fragmentation are fairly substantial. They break the canopy, they break the soil surface, but a small single track trail leaves the canopy, the tree canopy intact. The soil community under the trail can largely be left intact. And the landscape impacts of new trails can be very small. So wherever possible, we actually try to decommission roads or use them for service vehicles and get recreational users off the roads, unless they're very easy to maintain. Maintaining them at a recreational standard of quality is a lot more work than just managing them for service access.
Right. Yeah, those are all great points. So maybe Brian, help us understand kind of how does your land management agency monitor your lands in regards to recreation and visitation, and kind of how does that inform your adaptive management? I think that'd be helpful for us to understand.
Sure. So when it comes to adaptive management, we really try and focus very specifically on how could a land or a specific use impact a specific resource. And so an example of that is trail erosion washes into a stream and gives muddy water that affects salmonid habitat or steelhead habitat. And so one of our adaptive management protocols is to walk streams during or after rainstorms and look for evidence of soil flowing from trails downhill into riparian corridors or streams. And often in the weeks following a storm, you can see evidence of sandy deposits downstream of trails that are having a bad erosion problem. And so one of our monitoring protocols is for that. Where we have closed areas that we're trying to keep preserved for sensitive animals like mountain lions that really get scared of people and will leave an area if there's a lot of human use. We'll have game cameras out there to watch for mountain lions, but also to watch for people who are trespassing into those closed areas. And for each of these monitoring items, we will have a response built into our adaptive management plan. And so, for example, if we're seeing erosion, that means we got to spend more time shoveling out those grade reversals and fixing up our trails before the winter, or we got to fix the trail design so that it doesn't have erosion. If we're seeing people in closed areas, we've got to spend more time out there connecting with people and letting them know that, hey, these areas are closed for a reason, and could you be part of the team and stay out of these areas? We recognize that takes a lot of effort. And so overarching all of this, in all of our work, what we try to do is collaborate extensively with all the different trail users, bring them into the process, make them part of the solution, and remind everyone that we're a community. And maybe it's kind of like a big family and there's some sibling rivalry or whatever. But at the end of the day, if we all work together, we'll have far better outcomes than if we bicker and don't get along. So we try to bring people in, make them part of the team, and work together on this stuff.
Yeah, that's great, Brian. Thanks for that. You know, when you're talking about the monitoring and the having an outcome or a reaction, rather a response to that monitoring, you know, Marin Water, working with our partners through One TAM, has an early detection rapid response program where we kind of monitor all of the roads and the trails. And if we see invasive plants coming up, we kind of immediately target those for management, really recognizing that, you know, people can be a vector, and those are kind of high use areas and where we're going to see more responses from invasive plants. So that's great. I want to bring Matt DeYoung into the conversation now, and we got a couple questions for you before we go to the group. Matt, do you want to kind of give us an overview of how Santa Cruz Mountain Trail stewardship programs and projects support various land management agencies? So how your programs kind of uplift and support the different partners that you have?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're a nonprofit trail stewardship organization. We're a hybrid of professional staff, a professional trail crew, also a huge volunteer component of our work. So we work with all of our local land managers who have trail access here in Santa Cruz County, and also working in Santa Clara and San Mateo counties to some extent as well. So we're helping our partners with trail construction, trail planning, design, maintenance, funding projects, outreach and education. It's kind of the whole gamut of trails management besides enforcement we're helping with. So we work with organizations like Brian's at the Land Trust to help them plan out and build their new trail networks. We're helping state parks out, decommissioning old failing roads that have the issues that Brian mentioned, and building sustainable trails to replace those. We're helping do education about trail etiquette. And really also serving as that conduit between land manager and the public through creating stewardship opportunities. And we do about 10,000 hours of volunteer work every year, have almost 1,000 unique volunteers come out. So really, that's a great way to educate people about our public lands and what it takes to manage them by getting them out there actively participating in that stewardship.
Yeah, that's great, Matt. And tell us, I mean, you guys don't just, maintain one type of trail. So you guys are working on fire roads, hiking trails, equestrian trails, bike trails, whatever it might be. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we worked on all types of trails for all types of trail users, be it a ADA wheelchair accessible trail, hiking specific trail, multi-use trail, or mountain bike specific trail as well. So kind of the whole gamut. So we're trying to serve the broader user base out there. Our roots are as a mountain bike organization, but we found that we were best at doing trail stewardship for all trail users. We really transitioned away from being that mountain bike specific group to a general trail stewardship organization, which just allowed us to bring in that many more people to participate in trail stewardship and support our local land managers, many of whom are under resourced and need help with deferred maintenance and new project development. Right.
So maybe can you let us kind of what successful stewardship projects have you worked on that balanced visitor access with natural resource protection?
Yeah, I think a great example of one is Chitoni Coast Dairies National Monument, which is a project we're currently working on. It's a federal property owned by the Bureau of Land Management. It was declared a monument by President Obama on his way out of office. Through that presidential proclamation, the goals for that property were really targeted around conservation and public access, very similar to what Brian described the land trust's goals being. Hey, we want to preserve the public, we want to have great recreation. So, we started participating in that project as just advocates. So we were getting our constituents involved with the public planning process, educating them about that. And we developed our positions around the development of that property really collaboratively. We worked with neighbors, with other trail user groups. We were then Mountain Bikers of Santa Cruz, a couple of years ago. So we were working with the Horsemen's Association, neighbor groups, environmental groups to really develop a pretty broad position on the property, not just specific to trail use. We were advocating for conservation, protection of cultural resources, access for all trail users, disabled, equestrian, and whatnot, and also, really trying to mitigate impacts to the neighbors. So that was our approach, and also working with the land manager as well, like understanding what's possible here on this property. We don't want to be coming and advocating for things that are just totally off the wall, never going to happen. We want to be, we want to be helpful and constructive. So really having those conversations before coming out with anything publicly and sharing that messaging with our constituency. So yeah, that was the really effective strategy. Not everything we asked for was put into the plan, but that's to be expected. I think they say a good plan is when no one's quite happy with the outcome completely. So it means there's good compromise there. And through that process, we actually stepped up to the plate to help the BLM with implementation. We signed a cooperative agreement where we've taken responsibility for designing, funding, and building the trails at Shoshone Coast areas, as well as maintaining them for the years to come. So yeah, I mean, through that process, we've really taken all those management goals the BLM established through their planning process, and had to find that balance between recreation and conservation, and really looked at all those things that Brian mentioned too, like the sensitive habitats, the neighbors, the existing road network, as well as thinking about user experience out there. So it has been successful. The property has not opened yet, but we're really excited about it. It's kind of similar to some of the projects Land Trust has worked on. We're starting from scratch and building a new trail network to really meet these management goals and user experience desires. So we're pretty excited about that.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. That's great. I do want to kind of have one final question for you specifically, and just kind of help us understand how community organizations like yours can really help influence responsible recreation on the landscape.
Yeah, I think there's a number of things. And there's education, right? We can educate our constituencies about what responsible recreation looks like, and also give that broader context of this community and this place that we're recreating in. We talk about converting, egocentric trail users into ecocentric. So having that understanding of the place where we are is really important, right? So like, oh yeah, well, you shouldn't be creating that social trail here because you're disturbing mountain lion habitat. Those types of things, that type of context, it's really hard. Like public land agencies just aren't that good at communication. It turns out, no offense. So like anything we can do to bridge that gap between trail user and agencies is really helpful, just to give that context and use our reach. So yeah, things like that. Signage is another thing. So trail etiquette, so always a big one. We struggle to get that message out there, but we've tried to figure out some fun ways to do that, and we've done some comics that make it a little more fun and visually engaging, rather than having a sign that says yield the trail, so things like that. And I think really like advocating for best practices to be engaged. We have a lot of inertia in the way we manage our public lands. Mm-hmm. So I think, stepping up to the plate, like attending meetings like this and advocating for, hey, these are the things that we're seeing be successful elsewhere, maybe we aren't doing here. So looking at things like, user specific trails, really thinking about that user experience. I think a lot of times we design our trails thinking about just the sustainability, getting from point A to point B, and kind of miss that user experience element where, hey, people want to have a specific experience out there. And if we're not going to provide that for them, they're going to provide it for themselves. So just those types of things, bringing those to the conversation, I think are really helpful. Great.
Yeah, I appreciate kind of the ecocentric component that you're bringing up, because I think a lot of times we forget kind of all of us going outdoors to connect with something, to stay healthy, to be in nature. And there's an environmental ethic that is underlying all of our interests out there. And sometimes we forget to bring that forward first, to kind of find that overlap with other stakeholders and community groups to understand how we can plan for the future. So I'm going to bring everyone, Brian and Aurora and Matt, all of you back in, and just kind of have a couple general questions that we'll throw out to you all, and you can kind of just take it as you will and go back and forth if you don't mind, and we'll take about 10 minutes for this. But how do, we're going through this recreation planning process now. So how do we look beyond our own interests as a, community member or stakeholder to collaborate effectively with other stakeholders to start to develop those multi-benefit solutions? And you can kind of reflect on your own experience or your experience in planning projects that you've worked on. but kind of, how do you bridge that gap when people are standing with their flags on, one side of the, field saying, this is where we are and we're not going anywhere else with our outcomes that we see. So how do you bridge that gap, do you guys think? It really help us solve our recreational issues.
Yeah, I think it really taking the time to understand where people are coming from. I think we so often get hung up on just the no's, like people are anti or for something, but understanding why, I think, is where we often miss an opportunity to find common ground. And I think more often than not, we find that we are really interested in the same things, especially when it comes to trail use and access. User conflict is not something anyone wants to have out there on the trails. So kind of really understanding what those issues are and, trying to find the common ground and those multi-benefit solutions. I think if we step back, we can get to solutions that way.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Just through conversation and things like this, like inviting people to provide their input earlier in the planning stages, so that everyone has a seat at the table and all of the different perspectives can be heard from the beginning, I think is really important.
Yeah, and Aurora, maybe we can just kind of, riff off that for a minute. A lot of times, right, not everybody's in the room for the conversation. So do you Latino Outdoors, like, have you started thinking about ways to help land managers like us think about how to, include those voices when they're not here in these public meetings sometimes? Like, is it us going out to them and bringing that feedback back into the planning process, or, how have you all worked on that issue?
Yeah, we actually recently partnered with another land management agency down in the peninsula area. They're very early in their planning stages and really want to create this park for everyone to enjoy. And so we did a couple outings, a couple hikes, and we brought the community in, and it was just like a giant way of doing like an in-person survey, like talking about going with the people around the park and talking about what people are hoping to see in that space, or what about this space do you think works really well or what doesn't. So just providing those opportunities of engagement and really, again, just like listening to people's thoughts genuinely, so that some of the things that are being expressed can actually be put in place.
Great, thanks. What about you, Brian?
Yeah, I guess, this is all such an important conversation. And I would say that probably one of the biggest things I would hope people could do is believe in a better future. I think a lot of the conflict around recreation, a lot of the unwelcoming experiences that people have had in parks and open spaces, and a lot of the worry that some people have had about how other users are treating the land is a legacy of poor planning and inadequate facilities, and not being intentional about creating welcoming, safe, inviting opportunities to get together. The difference between squeezing onto a busy road shoulder to try to get to a trailhead and having a decent place to park safely, maybe even a place to go to the bathroom, that's a world of difference for a lot of trail visitors. The difference between having a number of different user groups squeezed onto the same trail or fire road, so that you have bikes going fast and people walking slowly and people being surprised by that, or that sets things up for conflict in ways that doesn't need to happen. And I want to applaud Marin Water for bringing people together, being deliberate about this stuff, and being intentional about kind of fixing some of the stuff that's not working well. And there's lots of scientific evidence that the impact that people have on biodiversity and other resources is not related to the number of people. It's related to how those people are managed and how well designed and built the facilities are that host them. And so, I think that if we can come together around this stuff, we'll have a bright future with more public lands protected for more more biodiversity, more water resource protection, more public access. If we argue about this stuff and people don't feel like they're part of the solution, you're going to have a discord, and there's not going to be public support for any of this stuff if it's all fractured. And we'll have less of all of those things that I think everyone on this call values a lot. So I'd say let's work together and find good creative solutions to this stuff.
Yeah, those are all great points, Brian. I appreciate them. They really kind of go to adaptive management right at the end in a way. And we're thinking about kind of, right, we're planning for the future here. We know that we're going to have to, make adjustments as, changing conditions occur and new technologies and new ways of recreating evolve. So kind of what adaptive management approaches have all of you kind of seen or helped establish that really were promoting sustainable trail and road networks or visitor access facilities? Like, are there any projects that you all want to leave us with that you're like, we really used adaptive management to think about the future and make some adjustments here?
Yeah, I think San Mateo County Parks is just undertaking a look at their trail standards. I think a lot of agencies kind of established trail standards like 30 or 40 years ago. I've just kind of been going down with the ship on those since then. So I think that, looking at the change in recreation over the last couple of decades is something that's really behooves us all, right? Because we see these challenges arising. We have these rigid policies on how we manage our trails, but, really thinking about, hey, maybe we can do this better by changing some of these designations or the types of trails we're providing. I think, like I mentioned before, that idea of the user experience is so important that we need to, provide those experiences, whether it's solitude and quiet or an exciting mountain bike ride. Those are things that people want to have, and those are all wholesome, healthy, good things that we should strive to provide. So I know here in Santa Cruz County, we have a major issue around unofficial mountain bike trail usage. And we've got, almost as many miles of illegal mountain bike trails as legitimate single track trails here in the county. And that's because we're not providing those legitimate experiences for mountain bikers. So, to think about, hey, how do we provide these experiences while also, meeting these goals we have to protect the environment and get along well with other trail users. And there's being done successfully in so many places. So I think, re-looking at the ways we think about trail use and who trail users should be, I think is a great adaptive management strategy.
Thanks, Matt. I think also important, acknowledging that everybody is recreating in a different way. And the whole goal here is to support access generally for the public to get out to these public lands, and thinking, collectively about what that means and how we do that in a way that supports kind of everyone's future vision and desired conditions of the landscape. So Brian, do you have any adaptive management kind of follow-up thoughts that you might have?
Sure. The getting away from fire roads is one of my favorites. Also providing different types of trail facilities and opportunities for different people, recognizing that we want to have little kids and old folks and people with accessibility challenges out in nature. And so having trails that are highly accessible. We want to be able to have people jam on their bike and get some exercise. And we also want to have trails for people who don't want to have a bike zoom past them really fast. And so having different trail use designations so that people can avoid bikes if they want to avoid bikes, and bikes can zoom around if they want to boogie through the woods. And we have dogs on our properties, and recognizing that dogs are totally incompatible with a lot of other uses. And so having a dog trail so that the people who want to take a walk with their dog can do that, but it's far from the water courses, and it's far from sensitive wildlife. So I guess my top recommendation is designing trails with specific uses in mind and being open to having different uses on different trails.
Yeah, that's great, Brian. I think kind of goes back to proactive management can help reduce the collective impact that we have on the landscape, and being thoughtful about kind of our design and how we're thinking about people moving across the landscape. So One of the things we're doing as part of this recreation planning process, right, is doing census surveys of watershed visitors, also collecting data about the patterns of use across the landscape. And then, right, we'll overlay that with our natural resources and have a thoughtful discussion and thinking about kind of how we can better manage and zone the watershed for those things. Aurora, I want to bring it back to you kind of as the closing thought, and just, I want you to kind of challenge us and help us all collectively think about, right, what we are not doing perhaps in terms of supporting diversity outdoors, and, you know, how we overcome those shortcomings that may be blind spots in our own understanding, whether we're just focused on our own interests, or maybe we're just land managers who are focused on natural resources too much. Like, what can you help us understand when we start talking about visitor access and recreation management?
Yeah, no, I think that, you know, both Matt and Brian brought up really great points. And, you know, I totally agree about having just more accessible trails that can accommodate different people's needs. And then also, you know, earlier in your presentation, Sean, you talked about signage and stuff. And I think signage and kiosks. And I think that one of the ways that we land managers can really promote diversity, equity, and inclusion is by providing signage in different languages. I think that's, you know, from the starting of the planning process, implementing that from the beginning, so that more people that, you know, might not have English as their primary language can still learn about the park and can still read the signs, so that they understand maybe the rules or the regulations of the trails that they're trying to go on. And that really just provides diversity and inclusion by making people feel more welcomed into the space, and even it's more accessible, because then again, going back to that knowledge, people now have that knowledge so that they can be best prepared when visiting a park.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, right, going back to something you said earlier, just about how important it is to help people see themselves in those parks, right? And recognizing that if it's not a park that's in their neighborhood, they probably haven't been there before. And so we need to make sure that, right, they're included in the vision of that park and that place and that landscape. And right, the watershed is an open area and provides water to the entire community, and all those community members and communities beyond are welcome to the lands. So I want to thank our panelists, Aurora, Brian, and Matt, for taking the time just to kind of share and think with us. You know, you all brought a lot of, you know, interesting thinking and knowledge about the way that you're managing these issues in your respective roles. And so we really appreciate you coming to think about this with us. So thanks for your time tonight. With that, I'm going to go back to our silent Zoom applause. We'll start giving you all voices in just a moment. Thanks for listening here. We really appreciate it. What we're going to go into now is I'm going to share my screen just for one more minute. If you'll allow me, let me switch this. All right, sorry about that. So we're gonna go into breakouts, and I just want to give everyone an understanding of the breakout rooms that do exist. We are gonna kind of push you into a room. You're not gonna choose the room, but we have design questions that will facilitate broad conversation. So we will have one breakout group that's really gonna focus on roads and trails. We want to explore a couple central questions. What ideas do you have for balancing the protection of natural resources, water quality with recreational access? What are some of the multi-benefit options that balance the needs of various visitor groups? And then what recreation management strategies can improve all watershed visitors' experience on the roads and trails? So we're going to think through those and have discussion. Group number 2, we're going to talk about visitor facilities. How can visitor facilities be modified or updated to protect natural resources while providing for public access? How can we ensure that visitor facilities create an inclusive and welcoming environment for diverse community groups? And then what facilities, programs, or partnerships are currently lacking, which we may create a more inclusive environment on the watershed? We're going to talk about how to minimize our recreation impacts on natural resources, kind of discuss recreation, and just acknowledge that all people have an impact on these sensitive natural resources. What ideas do you have for minimizing those impacts? What multi-benefit solutions do you see as potential management actions for addressing those impacts? And then what type of monitoring would help you better understand natural resource conditions in relationship to recreational activities on the watershed? And how might that help us inform adaptive management? And then finally, our 4th group is going to talk about stewardship and responsible recreation. So what can community groups and the district do to foster a culture of responsible recreation on Mount Tam? What programs or strategies do you think could foster a greater sense of stewardship for the interconnected systems of Mount Tam? And then what stewardship effort can result in multi-benefit outcomes that benefit the environment and various visitor groups? So those are all the groups. And with that, we're gonna push everyone into those breakout groups. We're gonna do it for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll come back and have report outs. So give us 1 minute while we reshuffle everybody.